And Barbara Kingsolver.
That's right.
Joseph Flummerfelt. Pretty long list. John Jakes. Welcome to DePauw University.
Now, I know this fellow here. Hey, Ken.
Please.
Hi. Secretary, how are you? Nice to see you.
Thank you all for coming. Without any further ado, please welcome the former Secretary of Defense, longtime Congressman and U.S. Senator William Cohen, who will be tonight's Ubben lecturer at 8 o'clock tonight. We're delighted you're here. And I don't know if you have any opening comment you'd like to make about what you'll be speaking on or the state of the world, but we'll open it up to our friends in the press afterward.
Well, I hope during the course of the afternoon and the evening to meet with some of the students and faculty members and to discuss what I call the grave new world that we've all entered in the 21st century. The kinds of threats that we currently face and are likely to face, what we as a free society can do to confront them, and the inevitable trade-off. And there will be some compromises that will have to be made in terms of what we now expect as a free and open society in terms of preserving our liberties and privacies and the need for security. We've seen some compromises. They're minor to date, but they're more likely to become more intrusive as the level of violence that might be inflicted upon us continues to grow. So those are some of the issues that I will probably discuss during the course of the evening. And I usually try to be as flexible as possible so the students that I meet with may inspire me or intimidate me into discussing other subject matters. But let me stop and say it's great to be here. DePauw has a terrific reputation. I come from a small liberal arts college background, Bode College, and I think you have something like, what, 2,300 students or so. When I was in college, we had 600 at Bowdoin. It was an all-male school at the time, and now that it's co-ed, I think we have up to 1,300, maybe 1,400 students, but very similar in background.
Questions?
Well, I'd like to ask you as a jumping off point there about your lecture that in 1997 you said that terrorism is escalating to the point where Americans would be presented with that choice between
right.
civil liberties and security. And then in your 9/11 Commission testimony, you said that Americans hadn't really necessarily grasped the
right.
magnitude of the threat.
Right.
What lessons are there left to learn for Americans?
Well, the most recent polls that have been taken show that I think it's almost 2/3 of the American people anticipate that we will be hit again in the United States, in all probability even this year. And so the expectations are high in terms of the threat against us. The question becomes, as they look around the world and see what is taking place in countries like Israel, by way of example, a country that I would say is probably the most security-conscious country in the world, and yet has been unable to certainly fully protect itself against suicide bombers, notwithstanding all the walls that are going up and the effort to contain it and to defeat it. Nonetheless, you continue to see that individuals are able to carry out suicide attacks with devastating consequences for a small country. And then if you think about a country the size of the United States with all of its vulnerabilities in terms of easy access to the country, the fact that we do not have anywhere near the kind of security measures in place that Israel or perhaps some other country might have, a small country, let's even say Singapore, also a small, tiny island country, so to speak, that is very concerned about security. And so you can see the potentiality for violence being inflicted upon our citizenry. The issue comes up in terms of what are we willing to tolerate. Now, every time I go through an airport security screen, I set the alarm off. I have a titanium hip. And so if you were to see me 5 days a week, I'll be up against the wall, my arms outstretched, being wanded, my shoes off, belt off, and people go by and they're kind of laughing, saying, what kind of a threat do I pose? For me, it's an inconvenience, and I think a misallocation of resources, but nonetheless, I'm prepared to accept that as a minor inconvenience if, in fact, this is going to produce greater security for me, but and for all the other passengers, obviously. But I think when you start dealing with issues, well, what about sharing travel information from certain airlines that now go into a central data point? Is this something that we are willing to accept? If you can see the reaction initially about travelers and passengers feeling their privacy has been invaded by a sharing of that information without their knowledge, you can see that there are still some, I think, notions that we don't have to release that kind of, or shouldn't give that kind of information. Questions are coming up now about the Privacy Act, the Patriot Act, rather. Whether or not it is sound policy and something that can be reconciled with our traditional notions of privacy and individual freedom, where the government can determine what you are taking out in the way of reading material. Is this something that smacks of big brotherism? Is it something that may be necessary? Should we be interested that you're reading the Quran or you're reading the writings of whomever? Does this somehow indicate that you are something of a threat to us? Well, that kind of contravenes traditional notions about the ability to read anything I want to read. And so what else has to be there in order to justify the government to start looking at what you're reading? Or what videos are you taking out now? Is this something that we should be concerned about? What is the balance of government's interest versus that of reconciling the liberties that we assume that we are justly entitled to as a democratic society? So those are the kinds of issues that have not really been confronted yet in a major way. They're starting to get into it. The Patriot Act was passed in the wake of 9/11. Right now, before we have other types of attacks, we have the opportunity to look at this much more coolly and analytically and try to come to some judgments in terms of, well, what sort of protections do we have against the government abusing this power? What is the filter? Where is the oversight? Who gets to decide? Is it simply the Attorney General? Is it the President of the United States who can decide what the indicia of suspicion would be for you? Your hair is long, you go to DePauw, you're wearing scholarly glasses, you've got a crew neck sweater on, and your jeans are a little bit ragged, and I mean, those kinds of things that might fit into a stereotype this person, a little bit radical. And by the way, he's taking courses at the university that are on the edge. Maybe we should be watching them. Now, I'm exaggerating it, but I think that we have to put it in terms of kind of hypothetical exaggerations, hyperbolic exaggerations, to say, all right, let's kind of crystallize what the issues are. And how do we cope with them? Is there a trade-off that's reasonable, or do we hold on to absolutes which become unrealistic in the wake of more attacks? That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Ken, I know you're anxious to get in here.
I'm going to have actually in a few minutes.
Okay.
I have to have you at. I have a couple questions
Sure.
for you, though. I'm more interested in what's going on in Iraq.
Right.
So I'll stay a little bit away from what
Okay.
you're going to talk about tonight. $10 billion fraud in the oil for food.
Right.
Has the United Nations been pretty hopelessly compromised in its ability to do Iraq for the United States by this scandal?
I think it's been impacted, to be sure, but the UN, the United States is looking to the United Nations really for political cover at this point, rather than taking over the operations of something. That basically is to say, help us set up an interim government so that it has at least the stamp of an international imprimatur, as opposed to being a hand-picked U.S. Construct with people being selected that appear to be the toadies of the United States. So in this sense, it's going to the UN as a, quote, international body. It certainly will be impacted in terms of the credibility of managing anything until they have some real serious investigations into what has happened. Were there, in fact, kickbacks? How did that take place? What about the bureaucracy? How could it have been allowed to go on? That all is a legitimate line of inquiry, but in terms of whether or not we're still looking for the UN to say, okay, help Mr. Brahimi, help structure this in a way that doesn't look as if we're dictating it, so that we can say that truly does have an international aspect to it that would soften the impact of the U.S. forces being in Iraq.
I have a question, but I don't know if you're going to ask this. So,
Go ahead, man.
This impacts more my generation of students, and that's the potential for the draft. And I was just wondering what your feelings on that were, whether you think that that's becoming more and more
Sure.
of a potential for us.
Well, Senator Hagel certainly has added some spark to the issue. Let me try to separate it out because I, like an economist, of two minds here. I'm a two-handed economist, which Ken will tell you that's someone who never reaches a conclusion. But on the one hand, on the other hand, if you're looking at it from a purely military point of view, in terms of military effectiveness and efficiency, you'd say the military will tell you we've got the best fighting force we've ever had because of people who want to be there, as opposed to people who were drafted and who don't want to be there, who are in there for the short term, and as soon as they finish, they're out. So they would say the volunteer force has worked. It started off rather slow in terms of the initial phases, but now they've got it to a point where it's a tremendously capable fighting force. And most military experts say we'd rather keep a voluntary force than have a draft. Then you say, okay, from a purely military point of view, then there are social issues involved. And this gets into two different levels. There, on the one hand, you may have someone like Charles Rangel, for example, a prominent Democrat who introduced this measure last year or sometime last fall. And his motivation, it seems to me, was to try to draw the American people's attention to the fact that if everybody is eager in supporting the war, let's see if we all don't share in it. So let's start talking about a draft so that there's an equal responsibility as well as all of the benefits that are being received by the American people. And so that was done to really get at the war itself. Senator Hagel is a little bit different from that, but comes perhaps to the same conclusion. Senator Hagel is saying, in essence, this is unfair the way it's structured because you have a narrower segment of the American populace who are doing the fighting and the dying and the bleeding and the being wounded. And as we're moving into this new age of terror, in which we can expect more and more people to be attacked, then we all should be willing to bear some kind of responsibility, namely some sort of national service. And frankly, I think there's a valid point to be made there as far as everybody being in this together, which was the sentiment we had back in World War II, when after Pearl Harbor we were all in it together. It was the same sentiment we had actually after 9/11, when people felt we're all in this together, and that sort of dissipated somewhat in the last couple of years. And so the notion that you would have some kind of a national service program, I think, probably makes a good deal of sense. Going to a draft, you have to be real careful in this because you inevitably get into exemptions. And if you have a draft with exemptions, then you get back into the inequities we had going back during the Vietnam War and before, namely that you get student deferments, other deferments, and people being well connected, being able to avoid it through a selective interpretation of the act. So there are serious social issues involved. And I think the debate should start. It's not something that's likely to happen in the immediate future. Even if you had a draft today, you would not be able to increase in great numbers the ability to put troops in the field immediately. It takes time to recruit, basically, or to train them, I should say, before they could ever be deployed. So the immediate problem we have is not going to be resolvable by a draft. Secondly, there's another kind of issue here, and that is the whole transformation issue that Secretary Rumsfeld has talked about, that started actually Bill Perry, my predecessor, that I picked up on and tried to accelerate, and then Secretary Rumsfeld is accelerating that. And that is, how do you restructure our forces by taking advantage of technology as opposed to numbers? Can you, in fact, look to technology as, quote, force multiplier, whereby, because of the precision of the technology, the munitions, how accurate they are, how destructive they are, that you can actually do more and achieve more with fewer people. So there's an element of transformation underway coming at a cross current now, saying, but we're committed to more and more conflicts. So you're running into this kind of a cross rough that we're faced with right now. On the one hand, President Bush, when he was candidate Bush, came into office saying the Clinton administration has got a hollow military, and 2 divisions not ready to report for duty, sir, which was wrong. We were not hollow, because that hollow military, in fact, carried out the campaign in Afghanistan and Iraq. we were stretched thin, admittedly, because over the years, ever since the end of the Cold War, the numbers of the troops have come down. So you have a smaller base, but you've got more and more commitments. And so we've got a real problem in terms of really stretching the forces. You now have the same size force that the Clinton administration had, but you have even more stretching. You've got Bosnia, Kosovo, but you've added Afghanistan and now Iraq. So it's stretching even more, and the way in which we're able to cope with that is by pulling in the Guard and the Reserve to make them part of the, quote, total force. Over in Iraq itself, we have roughly 40% of the entire fighting force there, Guard and Reserve, and it's going to go up. So what does that do to the strains back here at home with certainly the private employment, but more importantly, even that, the families who have counted on, you know, a very limited time of active duty commitment. Now they're there 6 months, 8 months, 12 months, and it's going to put a real strain on the force. So on the one hand, you're looking for transformation. On the other hand, you say, well, what does the future look like? Are we going to continue to be deployed in bigger numbers to more and more places? If we do, we have to have more troops. To do that, we have to spend much more money. And as I recall the numbers, it's roughly about 1.2 or 3 billion per 10,000 people. You take in 10,000 more, it's another $1 billion plus. So every 10,000, figure another $1 billion plus dollars you add to the budget. Now that may not seem like a lot of money, but in view of the fact they're spending almost $5 billion a month in Iraq right now. So this would be, in addition to everything we're spending, you got to count on that in terms of just manpower. So there are a lot of issues involved, and do we need more? If we're going to keep the same commitments that we have today, then obviously we have to have more. And you can try and rework it, what they call, getting into a little bit of jargon here, but tooth-to-tail ratios. In other words, your tooth is your fighting force out there. The tail is a support activity. And so you're trying to find ways in which you can, quote, outsource more of the administrative activities, the support activities, and use the same forces that otherwise would be doing administrative or support activities and put them in the fighting force. So that's one way of reallocating the tooth-to-tail ratio, which is a big tail and a pretty narrow tooth. So that's one way of dealing with it more effectively. But that raises all kinds of issues. If you're over in fighting a war, would you want to have American helicopter pilots flying in supplies? Would you rather have truck drivers who are military, or have some civilian contractors doing that? You've got all kinds of issues involved that have to be resolved. So tooth-to-tail ratio reallocation, that's one way of doing it. Adding more people and strength is another way to do it, but then you have to say, how do we do that? How do we attract them if it's going to be a voluntary force? What do we do to say, come on in, and here are the benefits, and here are the responsibilities, and here are your potential deployments? You got all of those issues, and then, well, what about a draft? So that's a kind of a third option out there. And what does that mean for transformation? So there aren't any easy answers to this, because all of it is it's not near term, it's long term. So then the issue always becomes, how do you look out into the future? How far can you look out into the future? Say, what are the threats that are out there that we're likely to encounter? How do we start preparing for them now? Because it used to take, at least it doesn't any longer, but it used to take almost 12 years, 12 to 14 years, from the concept of a weapon system to design, to testing, to final deployment of that system, almost 12 years. So by the time you think of something today, 12 years from now, it may be totally obsolete. But if you just keep thinking 12 years from now, maybe you'll never build anything. So you're in this box where you have to say, okay, we think that the world is changing radically. We're likely to see the proliferation of, quote, weapons of mass destruction. We know the impact of globalization. We know the sharing of information is an unstoppable force today, so that individuals like yourself would have access to information where you could construct something that's fairly destructive. So now I have to worry about individuals as opposed to a state. How do we structure our defense? How do we structure our national security in order to cope with it? How do we protect ourselves in a world in which it's not a Soviet Union, it's not a big state actor that can threaten us, but now a small group of people that can threaten us with horrific damage. So these are all the issues involved. So it comes down, well, do we need more people? Well, you say it depends. And it sounds like a politician's answer, that it depends. but it depends on how you see the future. It depends on whether you think that technology will be a, quote, force multiplier, whether you think that you can attract people voluntarily to do this, whether you think you can share the burden with a better utilization of your allies. Can you hold on to your allies? Is there another level of diplomacy that we have to go to in order to build a commonality of interest that we can start having a better burden sharing than we currently have? Those are all things that are in this mix, as opposed to saying, well, we need more. We do need more. The question is, how do you get them, and how do you not simply have numbers that become less effective than if you had greater use of technology or a greater blending of it? That's a long answer.
This issue a long way. It is a long answer.
It's a long answer, but
One of
that's
the
all
things you have-
involved.
One of the things you haven't talked about, however, is that with a draft, it might be a little more difficult for Congress to just rush to support
Oh,
a
sure.
president who is deciding that we're going to be interventionist all over the world.
Well, I think I mentioned that in reference to when Charlie Rangel raised this issue. I think that's what he was saying at the time, that as long as, if everybody's sons and daughters are in, you're going to be a lot more hesitant to simply say somebody else there. Yeah.
You said exemptions are inevitable.
No, I didn't. No.
Well, actually, I thought you did. Inevitably, there are exemptions.
I said if there. I think I said if.
If there are, is it possible that we could have a draft with no exemptions? Is it possible that we'd have a draft that would include men and women, college students with no college exemptions?
If you put it into a national service type plan, because you couldn't utilize all of the people in the military per se.
Well, the lottery means you don't take all the people.
Pardon?
The lottery means you don't take all the people.
Well, that's true, but you want to make sure if you're just going to have a draft, I think you're better off talking about a national service program so that everybody serves in some capacity. I think that way you get at the issue of exemptions or
So we would have
lotteries.
to contract out all of the mail service and all of the construction
Right.
and all of the cooking and so forth.
That's
on
right.
the basis we have our soldiers doing that.
That's right. You'd have people who then making a commitment to, quote, the national security.
Isn't that a better system than we have now?
I think it's a fairer system than we have now. The issue I tried to separate out in terms from a purely military point of view. The military would argue they're better off with a voluntary system as far as the capabilities. From a social point of view, then the equity is important here, and that's where that argument cuts most.
What do you think the public opinion shift would be if we had a draft in terms of support for this war in Iraq?
I think that you'd see the numbers change in terms of the support. I think that that would probably be bring those numbers down in terms of how many are in favor of going forward as we are today. I could be wrong on that, but I think that it's the notion that our troops are over there doing a good job, but they're fighting it, and we don't have somebody at risk at this point.
Why is it that this presidential campaign has not addressed this issue more seriously?
Which issue?
The issue of the draft, the issue of greater burden sharing, the greater breadth of sharing of the responsibility for the war, the fact that it'd be harder to go to war, have a president tell you that you got weapons of mass destruction, you got chemical weapons, you got a tyrant, let's go get them.
Well, let's go get them, that's the issue. That's really what I want to talk about tonight in terms of how do you go get them. What is the best way to attack in the war on terror? And I don't think it's primarily military. And that's where I would say that the war against terror is not going to be won on the battlefield. Put Iraq aside for the moment, and that's a big putting aside. But the war on terror is not going to be won on the battlefield. It's going to be won by good police work. It's going to be won by covert action, by sharing of intelligence across many countries and integrating that intelligence. It's going to be some special forces. For the most part, it'll be police work that you've seen take place in Great Britain and arresting people who are in possession of ricin, of people who have possession of explosives and ammonium nitrate stored in cold storage, etc. It's not going to be on the battlefield. So it's a little more complicated argument. I think that if you take President Bush, I don't think he's going to be advocating this. John Kerry's not advocating this. I think it's a debate that needs to begin, and to say, aside from the military aspect, because I think we have to keep that as not a separate category, but try to focus on what are we really going to need in the way of numbers. And then say, but now as a socially desirable goal, shouldn't we all feel that we're in this together in the sense that the threats to our existence are across the board. No one is safe in this country. Used to be, well, if you're in the military, in the front lines. There are no front lines anymore. We're all on the front lines. No rear lines, I should say, anymore. They're all on the front lines. Everybody here is vulnerable now. Everybody in the world is vulnerable. And so it's a different construct, Ken, on that. And I think that Chuck Hagel has done, and Charlie Rangel before him, have done a good public service by saying, let's talk about the equity in this. And if you look at those kids and their children who are 18 and 19 and 21 and 22, and you look at their backgrounds, and they're coming from middle America or lower incomes, trying to get a step up in life, and they're the ones who are bearing the burden for the most part, then you say there's something missing in this collective American willpower against the threats that face us.
Would you hope to see that debate begin after the election?
Well, I think it'll begin. I think Senator Hagel's saying we're going to begin the, quote, discussion now. Frankly, I don't see much taking place between now and the election. There aren't that many days legislative. If you look at the calendar, legislative days left, not that many. I think they'll be locked into discussions of what's happening with Iraq, what will we do with North Korea, South Korea, what will be the impact of the economy. Those are the big issues that you will see debated, tugging and froing from now until November. But I think it's important for Senator Hagel to have raised the issue now, to have us start thinking about it, talking about it.
I have time for one or two more questions. Yes, ma'am.
This might be a little bit of a touchy issue, but earlier this year, whenever Wesley Clark was a hot ticket item, received much attention, Newsweek ran an article speculating about the relieval behind the decision behind the relieval of Wesley Clark from his position, sort of portraying him as a renegade type person. And as you're probably aware, Clark came to DePauw to speak last year. And I was wondering if you could speak on your current and past relationship with Wesley Clark, and perhaps speak on your view of the circumstances leading to his departure.
I made a number of public statements at that time that because he had now entered into the political world, that I was not going to make any comment about it. He had served his country, he'd worn his uniform. We had our disagreements in terms of our relationship, which was not necessarily the most positive, and I let it go at that, but I didn't care to comment, still don't.
Okay. Then could you speak on what it was like to be both a senator and an author simultaneously?
A senator and an author?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I guess you're always kind of an author. In fact, my wife is about to enter the ranks of an author. She just finished her memoir, which will be out in a couple of weeks, and a new experience for her. I just finished a novel that I had started years ago that is long overdue, but it will be published in Germany, in German, but I'm not sure it'll be published in English. But I wrote it for a German film producer. I've been writing since college, so it was something I contributed to the literary magazine at Bowdoin, and I was on the law review at Boston University Law School and wrote there, and throughout my career I've always kind of scribbled things down, and it's always there. It's just I think there tends to be a one-dimensional view, or a view that most politicians are one-dimensional. And that's unfortunate, because you take a look at many, if you get behind the public image of many of the members of Congress, you'll find they have individual talents which are really quite artistic and quite extraordinary. But nonetheless, as T.S. Eliot said, we all prepare a face to meet the faces that we meet. And most politicians and public figures have to have that as well.
Is your wife not from Indiana originally?
She is from Indianapolis, and as a matter of fact, her book is entitled From Rage to Reason, My Life in Two Americas, and what it means to grow up as a black woman in a segregated society, and all that she had to encounter, starting right in Indianapolis back during the days when you had segregated housing projects in Indianapolis. So it goes from her career as a young girl, then a model, traveling throughout the South, what it was like to be forced to stay in separate facilities, not being able to be fed at lunch counters with her mother, and then going through all of the indignities that one had to endure by virtue of racial discrimination, and how her life was transformed when she finally went to the Pentagon, and inspired by the young men and women that she came into contact with. So it's a great story of inspiration, really.
Any other questions? Secretary Cohen, thank you very much for being here. Ken Bode now has you, so. From the lamb to the lion. Thank you for coming. We really do appreciate it. This gentleman, I believe, has a blast from your past for you.
I do. First of all, Alice Stewart says hi. She's my aunt.